Yeah, fortunately, you all have this short biographic notes about the speakers, so I don't have to say much. I'll just say one thing about Steve McCorriston. He's the project leader of another project funded by the EU, Transparency of Food Prices, which is very closely related to our Ulysses project. So it's very important that we have Steve's perspective on the issue, and he will tell us something about what determines price transmission. Steve, okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Highlight, I think, a different constituency who's interested in food prices and the way in which food markets work, because at the time of the crisis in 2007, there was another report by the European Commission on the functioning of the food supply chain. Obviously concerns something about what was happening in world agricultural markets was somehow not going through to consumers, but it wasn't quite clear what their agenda was, but there was clearly something that between the consumers and the farmers that must be something going on that affected the way in which these food prices materialised. And there's a bigger constituency who's interested in food prices within the DGs. I'm not sure the internal workings of the Commission, but DG Competition, DG Enterprise have been very interested in the functioning of the supply chain. We've had the high-level forum on the functioning of the supply chain. We've had the expert platform on food prices. Note, I'm not saying anything about agricultural prices, on food prices. The Competition Directorate had a review of competition policies and antitrust policies across all EU member states on what was happening in the food sector. The OECD Competition Directorate, not the Ag Directorate, the Competition Directorate, had a big session last October on competition in the food chain, which was a gathering of 200 antitrust specialists from around the world. In the United States, the Department of Justice, not the USDA, but the Department of Justice, held workshops all over the United States where hundreds of people turned out to listen to discussions and views about how the food supply chain was functioning. And so this is what we've been interested in Transfop. The title that Alberto has given me is What Determines Price Transmission. So I'm not going to tell you specifically what we did in the project. I'll tell you what we were really about, and I'll focus more about price transmission and why it matters. One caveat is that I amended these slides after coming back home last night after a couple of years with Tele-Educación, and I'm a bit worried a bit later on how one or two of them appear, which was because it was done on the hotel computer. So my apologies in advance. It might not materialise, but it might work. And I can always give you the website for this project where you can find working papers, etc. The reason why I amended my slides last night is because I wanted to, in a sense, pick up on one or two things that materialised yesterday, because in the discussions yesterday, I wasn't quite clear what we were focusing on. Sometimes we're talking about farmers, or was it consumers? Was agricultural goods the same as food groups? Well, actually it's not. What we focus on at the agriculture sector is not what we buy in the shop. Food products are very different from agricultural products, but somehow we use these things synonymously. We talk about food prices or agricultural prices. Are we talking about consumers or farmers when we talk about the effects of price volatility? Are we talking about world prices or domestic prices, and how these things are transmitted across borders, and how does that matter with what happens in between? And it's this distinction between agriculture and food, I think, which is really important, because clearly if there was nothing in between agriculture and food, they'd be synonymous, okay? But they're not. And when you think about the supply chain, we have agriculture that enters into the supply chain that finally ends up in the retail sector in the supermarkets. But the characteristics of this chain and how it functions is really important. So the broad headlines would be that almost every country in the world, particularly developed countries, we've seen an increase in concentration in the retail and processing sectors. I think one of the biggest headlines is in Australia, the CR2 concentration ratio of the two top firms is somewhere close to 95%. Okay, we've had the consolidation and the changes in the retail sector and also in the food processing sector have become really important. And even if you think, well, some of the examples that we had yesterday, we were talking about rice and Mali or whatever, maybe we don't have to think about supermarkets, whatever. One of my arguments is going to be at the end is that actually how we characterise markets and the role in which intermediaries might play in that market is also very important for price transmission. So the big pitch in broadly what we did in this transfer project, but broadly in terms of a research area, is that to really understand what goes on in markets and agricultural markets, you've got to understand what happens in between agriculture and food markets. And I think this is a big agenda because it's certainly not the case that we've resolved any of these issues, and I think there's lots of new issues in the agriculture and food sector that competition authorities and the agricultural specialists have to deal with. It's not just a developed country problem, it's also a developing country issue as well. So that's going to be the broad paintbrush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of skirt through some of the slides. The exam question that Alberto gave me, what determines price transmission, I'll talk about it, and I'll talk a little about the mechanisms because actually understanding what the economics are is really important about thinking how these things adjust. Okay, so why should we care about price transmission? Well, really it's about how the markets function. Okay, and the discussion we had yesterday, we had some allusion to this, functioning because there might be excess volatility or the role of financial markets create spillovers, but we didn't really hear anything about how agriculture and food markets actually function. What role do policies play in ameliorating the shocks, and what role does market imperfections or market structure play in these outcomes? And that's this latter bit that's going to be really important here, and this sort of ties up with how do we think about how these policies might actually work. There's different aspects of price transmission, world to domestic, across space, across markets. As many of these things we touched upon yesterday about trying to understand what the drivers of volatility are. I'm really going to focus on this vertical price transmission, which I think is a crucial issue, even if we don't have supermarkets in the area. And these issues, I think, are interlinked. There's a bit here about the policy context because I was reminded that it was a policy seminar, so there's several things about the policy context and price transmission, what's important, how are government instruments impacting on the transmission process, how does food inflation evolve? Okay, actually, we think about these events in world markets, but how does that translate into changes in inflation and specifically food inflation at the retail level? How does competition impact on this process of price transmission? And one of the things I'll come to at the end is some of the gaps. Because one of the things we were discussing yesterday was the importance of data in understanding how the food chain works. And I'm going to present a graph later on that talks about different aspects of looking at data in the food sector when we're focusing at the supermarket level. Because clearly, much of the work that's done on analysing food markets, tends to use monthly data that's come from national resources. And I'm going to ask the question about how reflective of that of what happens at the consumer end that really is. Okay, so price transmission covers different areas of economics. I can skip all of these things: public, micro, industrial organisation, international economics. And what's important about this is that in large part the issue of price transmission and competition is actually driven by some common mechanisms which I really want to highlight because it really highlights the role of the food sector in the adjustment of this process. So I'm going to give you a little bit of highlight from theory. There's going to be an equation or two, but I'm just going to flash it up just to sort of highlight what the mechanism actually is. I'll give you some ways in which we think about the price transmission process is actually appearing in the food sector and empirical studies. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about this mechanism is because those people who do econometrics report a number, and they think, well, we've got a number and it seems to be less than 1, and that must be reflective of something, but they're not quite sure what, but they're quite keen that they've got a number that's less than 1. Okay, and it's not quite clear how you should actually interpret that. Is it market imperfections? Is it whatever? And one of the problems I have with much of the work that's done in this area is that people get carried away with the econometrics. Let's have a tweak to the econometrics. Oh look, if we introduce a threshold, maybe it's even a bit less than 1, or maybe a bit more than 1, or it's a different number. And they have no conception of what the economics are. And I think one of the biggest issues I have in people who do price transmission is that they don't often think about the economic mechanisms, and in a sense what they're meant to be looking for in the first place, okay, which I'll try and pull out. So some issues that we think about as we go through. Important to have evidence based on insights, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. When we address competition, they apply to both developed and developing countries, although the issues might be a bit different. Highlight some of the issues that might need a little bit more focus. Do we have the right data? And what's the welfare metric? And I think this is really important because in yesterday's discussion, there was an illusion that somehow the interest of the farmers might be the same as the interest of the consumers. You know, volatility is bad, sort of for everyone. Actually, when you go into the competition domain, that's not quite so clear. And the metric that the antitrust authorities apply to thinking about welfare can be very different from what you and I might think about in terms of the welfare interest in the agriculture sector. And that's something I want to come back to maybe as a closing comment, because I think that's really important about understanding this link between competition policy and what happens in agriculture markets. So this is one of the inserts from last night. This is cumulative inflation. I think I can walk around here with the microphone. This is cumulative inflation in several OECD countries between 2005 2011. So this is food inflation. This is what we observe at the retail end. And you probably think, well, that's not a surprise because we had the shocks and food inflation went up. And you can see here the motivation for the story is that it exceeds by far non-food inflation. Okay, and it's higher in some countries, it's lower in some other countries, and so on and so forth. Here's a picture of food inflation in the UK. Now, if you go back to this picture here, okay, you know the UK is there. You know, cumulative inflation is very high. Actually, amongst the more established EU member states, it had some of the highest levels of food inflation. Okay, so big concern there. Actually, when you go to this graph here, the red line is food inflation. Okay, so if the previous diagram is high, but actually when you look at food inflation compared with what was happening in terms of agricultural price indices, not food price indices, agricultural price indices, actually that line looks pretty flat. Okay, so the illusion is that, well, obviously there's something dampening what's going on when you have these spikes in agricultural markets, but actually by the time it materializes through to the retail end, you know, even though we had high food inflation, somehow it's been dissipated. Okay, and that's partly what motivates people to get interested in this price transmission story, that these changes are not occurring properly. Here's a picture of a food chain. You can see the thing didn't come out quite so well last night, but this is the way in which we might characterize the food chain. I think the importance of this is fairly obvious, the type of thing you might give to first-year economics students or whatever, but actually people do miss it. And actually it's what we observe in world agriculture markets. I'm trying to point in case with the pointer. But what happens in world agriculture markets through to the food end actually depends on what happens in the food sector in between. And that one didn't actually come out because you can see that it's blank. But what the slide was that it was going to appear was the different aspects of competition, which I've already alluded to. So the retailing sector has become much more highly concentrated. The processing sector has become much more highly concentrated. The importance of contracts in between the different stages are really important, not just between the retailers and the processors, but between the retailers and processors in agriculture. And all of these factors might have an important role in determining what happens in world markets, which was essentially the discussion yesterday, and what happens at the retail. Okay, and these are two different things. Okay, and I'll come back to highlight why they're two different things in a minute. So This is the basic story. I'm going to give you an equation just to highlight what the mechanism is. I'm going to reduce that food chain to a single sector, but actually I can expand that in some way. So we're going to assume that the agricultural market, so the agriculture input from world or domestic agriculture, supplies the downstream food sector, shocks originate in the agricultural sector, and we want to determine what that process of price transmission is. Okay? So what we want to look for in this particular case is actually what's the mechanism that's going to relate what happens in world markets through to what happens at retail. Okay? So the crucial thing is, and here's a very simple explanation of it, this price transmission depends, it's a function of the change in costs, no surprise there. Okay, so agriculture enters into the processing sector, that affects its cost function. Okay? Now what's really important about this as well is that actually in many cases agricultural goods is a relatively small proportion of what the final product is. I think recent numbers from the USDA is that wheat, the input share of wheat is something like 15% in bread. So they're clearly, even if we get everything else about competition in the food sector, clearly there's other things that are going to matter. There's other inputs. So it's a relatively small share of what we buy on the food shelf. Okay? So even if you didn't have any story about competition in this particular case, actually you wouldn't expect relatively high levels of pass-through. Okay? But then this other thing becomes really important, and this is the change in the markups. So if you've got an imperfectly comparative industry, what's going to be important is not just the change in the cost, but how the food industry markups actually change when we have this change in costs. So it's the two things that interact. Okay, so it's this delta mu that matters when we think about competition. It's going to depend upon two things. One is how competitive the industry is. Okay, it's got a markup. Okay, but then, you know, it depends upon the intensity of that competition. But the really interesting thing about this from an economist's point of view is that that change in the markup, when you have a change in cost, depends upon the elasticity of that markup. Okay, and that elasticity of the markup is going to depend upon how the change in the elasticity of the demand occurs. Okay, so it's a bit of economics, and you can see this has been thrown out by the machine in the hotel last night, but this is the proper expression for price transmission, and it depends on lots of things, and it's fairly complicated. But if I close it down, okay, well actually it has thrown it out because this bit here. So let me just tell you what happens is that what's going to happen in this particular case is that if you close it down and you get rid of the sigma and the lambda and the something else, I think that's all you need to get rid of. If you set them equal to 0, and I'll tell you why you can set them equal to 0 in a minute, actually what you're going to get is the two things that are going to matter is the share of the agriculture input in the cost function and also the change in the markup. Okay, and if my thing's right, there it is. Okay, that's what you get. Okay, so it's two things that's going to matter when you get imperfect competition. The crucial thing here is the essays, the share of the agriculture input in the food industry cost function and the change in the markup. And if I'm lucky, no, it didn't give it to me, but I could tell you what that mu is actually equal to. And that mu is equal to the change in the elasticity of demand, the change in the elasticity of demand. Okay. Now, what's important from that, from an economic point of view? It's a bit technical, but the crucial thing then is functional form. Okay, and it depends upon the convexity of the demand function. If you have a constant elasticity of demand, actually the change in the elasticity of demand is 0, so you can have a monopoly in the food sector. Okay, that change in the elasticity of demand won't matter because of the functional form of the demand function. So it's a combination of different things that's going to determine that price transmission process. Okay, so we can extend that. That's obviously unrealistic, but that's essentially the basic mechanism. Okay, and what it serves to do in this particular case, if I go back here, is that what it serves to do is that as long as that demand function is not too convex, okay, so if you had linear demand functions, which we often work with, what happens in this particular case is that the competition in the food industry, or the lack of competition, serves to dampen the price transmission process. Okay, so if it was the case that the share of wheat in bread was, say, 15%, okay, that would be what you would expect your price transmission elasticity to be. If you've got less than comparative markets and a demand function that's not too convex, the price elasticity, the price transmission elasticity will be less than 15%. Okay, so competition or lack of competition in the food sector serves to dampen that price transmission process. Okay, so there's a few extensions which I won't sort of go through in detail because I'll be a bit conscious of Olaf telling me about time. The one thing that I want to just sort of skate through it, you can make these chains more complex. It's a bit of a challenge because in a sense we're dealing with successive oligopoly, not single stage oligopoly. Vertical contracts matter. I think this is the big issue which is going to be important, and that's buying power of what happens in the food sector and how that impacts on agriculture and that price transmission process. Not just pass through, but also the pass back process. And one of the big things that came out of these discussions about in the OECD Competition Directorate and also in the Department of Justice was the importance of buying power in the food sector. Okay? So in a sense, the mechanism that would be important would be sort of the same. It would be how that change in the markdown occurs, not the markup, but the markdown occurs, and it would depend upon the functional form of the agricultural supply function. But this is a really important area. But I'll come back to that at the end because it underpins this idea of what's the welfare metric we're dealing with, and I'll come back to maybe in the closing comments about that. Multi-product retailers, I'll come back to in a couple of minutes, and one of the other things we've seen in recent years is private labels, which again has an important role in the price transmission process. Progress in empirical studies, people have started to go away from time series econometric approaches because in a sense they don't tell you very much to structural approaches. A very important paper in the Review of Economic Studies last year actually highlighted this idea. This markup in the food industry is pretty elastic. Okay, so I've got 2 minutes, but I really want to do an like on maybe take 3. Okay, so here's some extensions. So one of the extensions is what do food prices at the retail level actually look like? So if you think about this food inflation bit here, this red line here, this is the type of thing that the OECD publishes. And you know, this is sort of aggregate data from the national statistics, etc. And this is how they calculate food inflation. And you can see here actually food inflation, though it's been rising, it looks pretty steady. Okay? And it's assumed that that's what we buy in the shops. Okay? Which is nonsense, because here's what we buy in the shops. Okay, now the hotel computer has missed off my lines here, my headings here. But let me tell you what this is. If you just take the top diagram here, what this is, what this data comes from is scanner data. So this is the thing that goes through the supermarket checkout. Okay? So when you go to the checkout, you buy your shopping, you scan it. Okay? So it doesn't come from national resources, sources, it comes from the private sector where you have to buy it. Now this thing up here, okay, is a particular brand of bread. It's Kingsmill 200 grams or whatever the weight in Kingsmill white loaf. Okay? Sold in different supermarkets. So it's the exact same brand sold in different supermarkets. Okay? Now, the starting thing is that there's no one price. Okay? And the other thing is that despite the inflation figures looking pretty smooth in aggregate and whatever else, actually, this is the prices of the exact same product sold in the 6 different retailers in the UK. They all price the thing completely differently. Okay? This is orange juice down here. Okay? This one here, the flat line is jam. But the important thing about it is the exact same brand of that. It's not just jam, it's an aggregate. Okay? It's, you know, medium-sized jar of whatever particular label it actually is. Okay? And one of the big things about understanding price transmission, if you're really interested in understanding what goes on at the consumer end when you have price volatility, actually you've got to understand what's going through the checkouts, and that becomes really important. And let me just say a couple of other things. So one of the things we've been working with is price transmission. I think this is where it might go the wrong way. So if you can all sort of lean to the left slightly, the hotel computer, I couldn't correct it in the hotel computer last night. So, but what was it? This is price transmission for the brands, closely related brands, going through the 6 different supermarkets. What's really important about this is that price transmission varies across the retailers, okay? 0 minutes, okay? But I just want to say one thing more, okay? Let me say 2 things more, if I can. It's really important about the welfare metric, okay? Because when we talk about food price volatility, who do we care about? Actually, antitrust authorities who have been really more interested in competition, actually their welfare metric is consumers. And the important thing about this buyer power, which has become really important, to the extent to which buyer power does not impact on consumer welfare, okay, it's okay. Okay? If buyer power is reflected in lower prices for the consumers, the antitrust authorities won't see it as a problem. Okay? And I think this is really important about understanding this link between competition and what happens between agriculture and food prices. The one thing I just want to close on, if I can, is we're talking about developed countries here, but actually developing countries matter as well. And what we've got here is a market of an intermediary. Okay? And what's important about this market for an intermediary, I've got up here at the top is a parastatal. Okay, so we're moving away from supermarkets, etc., and just thinking about an intermediary that procures rice and distributes rice or whatever. Actually, what's really important when you think about these things is that it depends upon the sources of the shocks. So here we've got a completely homogeneous product with no processing. It depends on the sources of the shock between D and M. These are price transmission, and it also depends on the extent of competition in the sector. And one of the things which I've had a little bit more time is that people think that more competition is good. Okay? Now, you've got to be careful about that, because actually, if I had more time to explain these results, what's important, one of the big lessons that comes out, is that it depends where the competition arises. You know, is it in the domestic sector? Is it in the intermediate sector? What happens in the downstream markets? It depends on the sources of the shocks. But actually, the trade-off is, it's all contingent and functional form to some extent, but the trade-off is that a lot of thought will leave you with is that as markets become more competitive, actually price transmission increases. Okay? But as price transmission increases, okay, I had a bit more flash here, but as price transmission increases in this particular way, is that food security metrics increase. So you end up having this trade-off between actually the underlying level of food security can improve, but when you're exposed to shocks, actually the volatility is transferred a bit further, and that becomes a bit of a trade-off about thinking about volatility. Volatility in itself has got to be seen in the context of what other food security metrics are actually important. And there's the summary which highlights some of those things. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Steve. I gave you 0 minutes and you used them very well. So I think we'll have just the clarifying questions, 1 or 2, just if you feel you want to immediately react. Yes, please. Just wait for the microphone.
Yes, thank you. My name is Wim Kloosterboer. I'm here for the processing sector, and I was wondering, you said that something can be achieved by having better relations, contracts between the producers and the processors. That's one thing. And accordingly, you mentioned also the retail. But what could be done with the retail? What is in our hands? Did you study that, or what can be done? Yeah, you said there's a difference across the retail sector in terms of transmission, but what can we do to increase this transmission in the retail?
Okay, so I think so what happens with the retail was that if I had my picture that should have been there actually come up, is that often the way in which you model these things, you have processing and then you have retail, but obviously how you characterise those links between these two actually matter. And what's important in that context of processing being imperfectly competitive and retailing being imperfectly competitive, you have successive monopoly. So that markup issue that I highlighted becomes exacerbated, and that pass-through can actually decrease. Now, what happens when you have contracts between retailers and the processing? To the extent to which they diminish what we call the double marginalisation issue. So even if the retailers capture the rents from processing, actually increases pass-through. And so you get that trade-off between actually the retailers increase their role in the food sector and become more powerful at the expense of other players in the food sector, but actually pass-through, when you have these shocks, can actually increase. So again, it gets into this sort of trade-off between what we're concerned about. We're concerned about rent capture or profit capture from different stages, and the processors will go to the antitrust authorities. But actually, when you think about shocks, is that actually, and one of the things which I didn't have, so another way to characterise that is private labels. Because in a sense, what private labels do is they represent the retailers having more control of the food sector. And what the data shows is that the pass-through for private label products is higher than it is for branded. And that's because they're capturing more control of that vertical chain. Okay.
Another one. Last one.
Yes, just a small comment. I found very interesting your presentation. But I mean, if you look at the developed and developing countries, I think this is, there are two things. The impact of volatility and of high prices is bigger in developing countries, after what you said, not only because the share of food is higher in the total, for the total consumption of consumers, but also because the share of agricultural products is much bigger in the end product. I think that is an additional conclusion we can get. Am I right?
I mean, that would be right. But what I was trying to do with that last slide, which admittedly was extremely quick, was that actually, you know, you might sort of think, when I tell the story about retailers, you might think, oh well, when you think about developing countries, maybe it's less of an issue, and it doesn't, you know, maybe that's an issue for the developed countries. But actually, when you think about agriculture markets, rice markets in Mali or whatever, the competition isn't an actual issue. Well, the main point I was trying to get is that how you characterise those markets, whether it's local dealers buying from farmers. So you're right in terms of the big picture that it's a higher share and higher pass-through. The main point I was trying to make was that how you characterise the way those markets function in developing countries is also a really important constituent about thinking about the pass-through. And what I didn't, you know, I glanced over it very quickly, but the key thing about that market at the end is that we have a procurement market. We have the farmers there and who the intermediary sells on to. And often the interests of the consumers and the producers, the consumers and the farmers, are not necessarily aligned when it comes to the shocks. And it's because of how you characterise that intermediate sector. Even if it's local traders who have monopoly power in local markets, that becomes really important. So you're right in terms of the broad headline. I was really sort of flagging it up to sort of highlight the point that actually thinking about how these markets work, even in developing countries, is really important as well.
Okay, thank you.